We're looking at session number 68 today. Mark 13, the first 4 verses. We finally finished with chapter 12. We're moving into chapter 13, which is one of the most difficult chapters of Mark, by the way. Our title, I've stolen this from Jeremiah fundamentally, The Temple, the Temple, the Temple. Well, chapter 13 brings us Mark's longest explanation or presentation of any discourse by Jesus. By discourse, we just mean teaching session. So this is the longest teaching session that Jesus gave that Mark records. And it's the most difficult of Jesus' teachings to unpack and understand. People tell us that we should wrestle with 3 questions. The first one, and probably the most difficult, and probably the one we'll spend the least time on, and we'll dismiss it really quickly and say there are 3 theories about this question. The question is, what is the origin of the discourse? Where did it come from and why? And the answer is, most of the theories, there are 2 or 3 primary theories, and none of them satisfy me very well. The answer is maybe we don't know where they come from, what the origin is. I'm not sure that's critical. Jesus thought it was important. That would seem to be enough. What's the second question? What's the purpose of the discourse? Why is Jesus giving this discourse at this time? And the final question, question number 3, what is the meaning of the discourse? What's Jesus trying to tell us? What does he want us to understand? What does he want us to take away from this teaching? Well, again, as I said, there are a number of theories that attempt to answer the questions. There's no general agreement about them, particularly about question number 1. About the origin of this sequence. What started it? What caused it? What brought it about? We'll have to face questions from skeptics about the veracity of several passages. Some passages are difficult to swallow, but we'll have a go at them. We're not going to pass over without comment some difficult passage. We're simply not going to go there. We're going to attempt to answer as best we can what any question is, what this verse means, what Jesus wants us to take away from it. And as we go chapter 3, we're going to see a repeated pattern, a cycle, if you please. Starts out about the apocalypse and what is an end times problem. That's where it starts. The presentation, Jesus will state an end times problem. Then Jesus, secondly, will give an exhortation with respect to that problem. And finally, Jesus will tell us the reason that he gives that exhortation. So it's an end times problem, an exhortation about the problem, and a statement about why that exhortation is important. And that will be repeated. The explanation that I like is that Jesus wanted to give us practical, ethical teaching to prepare the church to thrive in a hostile world. That's what the end times is about. It's about hostility coming to a climax. Jesus remains sovereign. He's still in charge. He has not abdicated, but because of him, the church will have trouble. Because of who he is, what he teaches, what he stands for. Because of those things, the church will have opposition. And Jesus' teaching is going to oscillate between two times, AD 70 and the end of the age, the final acts of history. There are predictions for both times. It will begin with the near situation, namely AD 70, which is now not so near for us because it's 2,000 years almost in the background or in the history. But let's go back and pick up Jesus' predictions as Jesus and the 12 leave the temple grounds. They've been there all day. They've been through several battles and challenges. And Jesus says, actually in this chapter 12 part, he finished his public ministry. And now Jesus intends to focus on the 12 about what is to come in the next few days and beyond. Jesus knows the 12 will face hard times and difficulties with suffering, persecution, even death. He's not going to skip over any of it. Remember, he had entered the temple grounds back in chapter 11, verse 27. And this is where he was ordered to tell the members of the Sanhedrin by what authority he had cleansed the temple. And you remember how that went. That was probably on Wednesday of Passion Week, just a couple days before the Sabbath that began on Friday, which was also the beginning of Passover. And it may still be Wednesday as he and the 12 leave the temple grounds. We don't know whether it's Wednesday, Thursday, but we suspect it's still Wednesday. Mark 13, verse 1. We need to have some kind of serious problem sounding here. I didn't help that, did I? And as he, Jesus, was going out of the temple, one of his disciples said to him, we don't know which disciple that was, by the way, but one of his disciples said to him, Teacher, behold what wonderful stones and what wonderful buildings. The guy was all enthralled with the grandeur he saw in the temple grounds. Again, we don't know who it was, but he was evidently impressed, as would all Jews. But that's not the reason they should be impressed with the temple. While it was a beautiful building, one of the wonders of the world at that time, the important thing was the presence of Yahweh. So the 12 saw the grandeur of the stones, and we're going to talk about that in a second. Some of those stones were as large as 37 feet wide, 18 feet high, and 12 feet deep. And these are marble stones, white marble stones, 37 by 18 by 12 feet. I've even seen a commentator who said it could be as big as 50 feet long, 20 feet, 25 feet high, and 15 feet deep. A marble stone that was actually too large and too heavy for most modern cranes to lift. Would you believe that? Think about what that meant when the building was being built. They didn't have any cranes. It wouldn't have helped if the cranes couldn't lift it. Anyhow, again, the stones were white marble, and some of them were not adorned with gold, but some of them, I understand, were actually clad in gold. And so you could see it shining with the sun, just glistening off those stones. Now, the temple grounds themselves were fairly sizable. It's estimated that the temple grounds took up 1/6 of the entire area of Jerusalem. The main building could have measured, at least in Jesus' time, and after Herod had done his heavy lifting and remodeling, that building, the main temple building, could be as big as 1,500 feet long, 1,200 feet wide. That's a big building, folks. The temple was the third temple, sort of. The first temple was Solomon's temple, which also was a significant building that was beautiful, full of grandeur. It was a magnificent building as well. The second temple, known as Zerubbabel's temple, Zerubbabel was the governor of Judah after the Babylonian captivity. And it was built again after the return from Babylon. It was smaller than Solomon's temple and of less beauty, significantly less beauty. Some of the old people who remembered Solomon's temple, if you remember back in, is it Zechariah or Haggai, talked about when they saw the plans and the foundation such for the Zerubbabel's temple, they cried. The third temple wasn't really a third temple. It was done by Herod the Great as a monument to the Herod clan. It was a bragging rights, if you please. It was, in fact, a remodel of Zerubbabel's temple, which was small and it had fallen into disrepair prior to Jesus' time. The last version that Herod began, he began the reconstruction or the remodeling or the additional work in BC 19. Roughly 15 years before Christ was born. The last version, again, was completed not even in Jesus' time. We'll see that in a minute. It was completed in AD 64. So we went from BC 19 to AD 64, so that's over 80 years the temple was worked on and made more beautiful, larger, more meaningful. But keep in mind that AD 64 is just 64 or 6 years before AD 70. And AD 70 is a central point in what Jesus' teachings will be concerned with. He had been under construction, the temple had, for over 40 years when Jesus came on the scene. You look at John 2, verse 20. John wrote, "The Jews therefore said, 'It took 46 years to build this temple, and you will raise it up in 3 days?'" So think, from BC 19 to 46 years later, that would be putting it around AD 33, somewhere in there, which was the end of Jesus' ministry. So Jesus has said, "You destroy this temple and I'll raise it up in 3 days." Of course, he didn't mean Herod's temple, and it wasn't Herod's temple, it was just called that. But Jesus said, "You kill me and I'll raise myself up in 3 days." But they took it to mean that he was going to rebuild the temple in 3 days after it was destroyed. So it had been under work for over 40 years when Jesus was there. The 12 saw grandeur when they looked at the temple, but Jesus saw idolatry and destruction. Idolatry, check Jeremiah, and this was where you get my title. Jeremiah 7:4. "Do not trust in deceptive words, saying, 'This is the temple of the Yahweh, the temple of Yahweh, the temple of Yahweh.'" There's that temple repeated 3 times. The people believe that since the temple represented God's presence with them, the temple effectively offered protection and security that no nation would be able to violate. That's what the people thought. But because of their infidelity, God said, "You say that, you're using the word temple, you're using the temple itself as a sort of magic, I'm missing the word I'm looking for, a good luck charm. You're looking to the temple as a good luck charm, keeping you safe in protection, providing for you." But God said, "Because of your infidelity, I'm going to show you how you are wrong. I will leave from this temple." And once God's presence was gone from the temple, there was no guaranteed protection. And Nebuchadnezzar came in and destroyed Solomon's temple in Jerusalem in 586 BC, 580 years at least before Christ was even born. The 12 saw grandeur, okay. Jesus saw destruction and judgment. Look at verse 2. This is Jesus' response to their discussion of the beauty of the temple grounds. Mark 13:2. "And Jesus said to him," whoever it was of the 12 that was speaking, "Do you see these great buildings?" That's sort of a put down, actually. He says, "You really looking at these great buildings? Not one stone," and remember the size of those stones? "Not one stone shall be left upon another, which will not," and it's a double negative, "not one stone will be left upon another, which will not be torn down. He said every block of this building is going to be torn down. Think about the size of those blocks. What would the simplest thing to be to move them? I think to roll them off the temple grounds and into the Kidron Valley. And as a matter of fact, that's where they were going. Now, of course, Jesus was prophesying about Titus, the Roman general, his siege of Jerusalem, and the destruction of the temple and the city in AD 70. And by the way, that was a response to the rebellion of Israel by a few zealots and others. And so Titus walked in and said, I'm going to fix this rebellion. The temple was razed, R-A-Z-E-D, not raised up. It was torn down with the stones moved into the valley of Hinnom, which was part of the Kidron Valley, whose floor was raised several feet by all of the stones and trash from the temple. So the temple was just thrown down in the near low spots. And those spots got raised up because of all the garbage. Only the western wall, the Wailing Wall, remained when the temple building was leveled. And this is what Jesus is talking about. He's talking about the temple building being raised, R-A-Z-E-D. The wall, however, was built to support a huge platform out over the Kidron Valley, 200 feet above the valley floor. And on it, several things, several buildings and so forth were built. And so that platform supported a large area with several buildings. The platform and the things on it all went into the valley. But Jesus' prophecy referred to the temple buildings. So everything on that overhang, plus the temple and everything else there, went into the Kidron Valley. Titus was the one who led the destruction that Jesus just proclaimed. AD 70, what did it represent? And that's fairly clear. God's judgment on Israel, just as it represented God's judgment when Babylon destroyed Jerusalem and the Solomon's temple in BC 586. So, 586 to AD 70, 670 years after the Solomon's temple was destroyed, Herod's temple was destroyed. Now, some commentators make two observations about verse 2, and I'll give those to you, and you may take them as you will. Jesus used a double negative to emphasize the nature of the judgment by a foreign nation, or through the efforts of a foreign nation. This time Rome. With Solomon's temple, it was Babylon. But God uses foreign nations to chastise Israel. He's done that through history. Well, Jesus' phrase, "do you see," was actually a mild chastisement for the 12 falling into the trap of most of the Jews. God's presence in the temple will not allow our defeat and destruction. And God said, you want to watch this when I leave? Mark's narrative just reeks of a declaration that judgment, the end, is near. And if you look in Zechariah 14 about the end times, you'd get the same feeling that the end time is close. You got to be careful about what close means, of course. The near judgment was near. It was only 40 years away, or less than 40 years, when Jerusalem would be leveled. If you want a somewhat different view and perspective on all of this, you can find the parallel material in Matthew 24 and Luke 21. I think in Luke it begins about verse 8. In Matthew 24 probably begins about verse 1. So Matthew 24 and Luke 21 deal with the same discourse, the Olivet Discourse. You can also go in and look at Peter's words at Pentecost in Acts 2. And you can compare what Peter said in Acts 2 with what Mark has written in verse 13, which is also interesting because most seem to believe that Mark was writing his remembrances from Peter. Well, the words again begin a three-stem cycle. We mentioned a bit of this earlier, but it's going to be a little bit different here. The first statement is about the beginning of a time of suffering. Then it moves to a great tribulation, and then it moves to the end. We'll see that pattern repeated through chapter 13. And we're going to be moving back and forth between now, AD 70, end. Now, AD 70, and the end times. So, and it's going to be hard sometimes to know which Jesus meant at any particular point in his discourse. He had left the temple grounds, and he moved up on the trail of Olivet. Maybe he was heading eventually to Bethany for the night. We don't know. No statement is made that way. But part way up Olivet, 4 of the 12 came to Jesus and asked him further questions. I'm looking at Mark 13, verses 3 and 4. And as Jesus was sitting on the Mount of Olives, opposite the temple, he's part way up the mount, on the opposite side, the eastern side of the temple. They can sit there and look down into the temple and grounds and see it very clearly. Peter and James and John and Andrew were the 4. The 3 enter closest to Jesus: Peter, James, and John, and Peter's brother Andrew. We're questioning him privately. And here's what they ask. Tell us, when will these things be? And what will be the sign when all of these things are going to be fulfilled? They want to be able to read the future when it occurs. Again, what did they ask? When? What sign will tell us that this time, that when all these things are going to be fulfilled? So probably involved would be who as well. They have had evidently separated the 4 from the other 8, because there's no mention of the other 8 here. And they wanted to know how to identify the future events. They actually wanted to know the future. then they knew that Jesus could likely give them a picture of the future. They evidently expected that the end times activities would happen. Perhaps Jesus would usher in the kingdom even that week. Remember, they were looking still for Jesus to bring the kingdom of God to the earth now, soon. Surely Jesus wouldn't delay his taking over as Messiah. Well, they were wrong, of course. They wanted to know when, how, and who, or whom, take your pick. The view from their position on Olivet, again, was a great position, a great view. They could look, they were several feet, maybe 200 feet above temple grounds, and they could look right down into the temple grounds and watch what was happening. Their question was even more pointed, as Matthew tells us. Look at what Matthew adds that Mark did not. Matthew 24, verse 3. And as Jesus was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples, he doesn't take four out. And this said the disciples came to him privately. He doesn't tell us, Matthew doesn't, how many of the 12 came. So, as he was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, there were no other people around, apparently, tell us, when will these things be? That's what Mark asked. And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? So Matthew writes that their questions included not only describe it so we can see it happen, but they ask, what will be the sign of your coming? They must have known that Jesus was to come at some point. We say come back, or come in return, or come again. That's not used here. It just says, what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age. And they were associated, Jesus coming in some way, with the end times. In some way, they knew that Jesus evidently was going away, and then he'd come back, all pointed to the end of history. The four likely knew something of Zechariah 14, which is a great read, by the way, and its view that seemed like the end would come about quickly. And of course, the writers in the New Testament all also felt that the end time was near. Jesus is going to answer their question, but not in the way they anticipated. Jesus preferred to exhort them. Remember, he's going to start with a problem, an end times problem. Then he's going to an exhortation so that they'll be prepared for the opposition and persecution that's going to come before then the end. And so that's what we're going to see over the next sessions. Jesus wished to give them warnings about what to look for and how to respond when that time came. So that's what I think is the purpose of the discourse. He's trying to prepare them to be able to handle, to stand firmly in obedience to Yahweh when the end times, persecution, and even death were to come. Jesus began that effort, will begin in our sense, because we haven't got there yet, is going to begin in verse 5, and it will take us into our next session when we'll look at verse 5, but his response is going to take us through verse 23. We won't get that far next time. But next time we're going to go to verse 5 and see how Jesus goes through this three-step cycle. Problem, exhortation, purpose.